Good afternoon and welcome to the December monthly meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Early Education and Care. I'm Noni Lusseau, chair of the board. It's wonderful to see all of my colleagues here, including our newest member of the board, who's going to remind us all about where this begins and why we do this work. He looks very safe and secure. He's got good attachment. That's Felix. So great to see you all. I hope those of you joining from home and your offices are doing well. Welcome to the meeting. As you saw from the commissioner's message, we're sort of at a mid-year check-in in some ways. That's the frame, both on policy and operations, and especially in terms of operational grants and some of our ongoing work. Bureaucratically, also, we had a chance to read the annual report. We will vote on that. That is for calendar year 2020, which certainly seems like a lifetime ago to many of us, I'm sure. We will also, as we do each year, vote on the EEOST capital fund regulations. We also have a vote in light of a rate increase as part of the FY22 budget. So with that, I think, in many ways, we're at mid-year calendar year inflection point on a lot of fronts. I will turn it over to the commissioner, who continues to move through with her team these, somewhat dynamic and also challenging, but hopeful times. So turn it over to the commissioner.
Excellent. I'm not sure if the secretary wanted to make any comments before I went.
I'm sorry. That's the second time in a row I've skipped over my friend and colleague, Secretary Pizer. Apologies.
It's all right. I'm not insulted. I'm sure people were applauding out there who were watching, but nonetheless, I have
no underlying message there.
I just wanted to note that yesterday the governor signed the so-called ARPA bill, which totals about $4 billion and is actually a combination of both state and federal funds. The bill doesn't really have any major items, I would say, that directly address EEC or EEC license programs, although there are several that may have some, at least indirect impact. For instance, there's $16.5 million for loan repayments for human services workers, and that includes childcare workers. There's also funding for a variety of workforce development initiatives, including adult education and ESOL, some of which may include early education providers and staff as well. There's $2 million for early intervention vouchers and another $10 million to support workforce in private special education programs and schools, including residential schools. On that last point, I also want to let you know the governor is allocating close to $1 million in state and federal funds to private special education schools, primarily to address their critical workforce shortages in order to improve their competitiveness in recruiting and retaining clinical staff and frontline service and care workers. So there are significant resources that are soon going to be flowing out to those folks, as well as hopefully some of the resources that are coming through the ARPA bill that will find their way into programs or into our workforce in one form or another. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks very much. So certainly lots of activity in that ecosystem, if we think about it in terms of our own mission and populations that we touch. So that's good to hear. Thank you. Turn it now over to the commissioner.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm glad to have the secretary address some of the larger statewide investments as we talk a little bit more deeply about some of the work that EEC, update you all on some of the work that EEC has undergone with the votes that you've all taken in the last few months. I wanted to first start specifically on the workforce policies. And as you know, we provided an updated workforce policy approach in the last couple of weeks. We know that this is a big change for people, and I'm going to highlight a couple of the biggest changes, not the least of which is a ceasing of our teacher qualification process right now, which is running about a 60 to 70 day backlog. So while we get our registry up and running, the biggest change was eliminating people having to send us the qualifications and really learning from the last year about the ways that program directors were better primed in some ways to assess the competency of the people that they were hiring, as we've been talking about. to be able to serve in their classrooms. So we have revised our approach, as you saw in the workforce policies that we released, that were specifically designed to set minimum hiring requirements for our programs and empower our program directors to use those to find staff that they could recruit into positions, and provide some flexibility about what coursework needed to happen prior to being in the classroom versus what could happen over the course of the first few months, so that we could recruit new staff and new workforce, and really think about building their skill set over the long term. That said, we know that this is a big change. We've gotten a lot of questions, and we continue to provide office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. In the first week, we had over 250 people join us for those office hours, and found them extremely helpful, from what I understand from the feedback we got, to be able to answer some of these very big questions that we have for how they apply these to their site. I want to say a lot of the questions got are really about individual programs hiring practices, things like checking references, things like evaluating transcripts in terms of, is a transcript real or not? And those are obviously things we hope our program directors can rely on their own program policies for, and their hiring policies, to make sure that if someone claims they worked at a job, that wasn't something we were checking in our teacher qualifications anyway, that in their hiring procedures that they would do reference checks or validation of a resume as appropriate, either through questions or through vetting of candidates. So we continue to reinforce that those are, as individual employers, we want to empower them to apply their own policies and eliminate bureaucratic steps for us to validate things that were causing some backlogs. That said, we continue to roll out our registry, and as you've seen over the last few months, build out the next 6 months of building that to be a comprehensive workforce database that would help make sure that we don't recreate the backlogs as we bring some of that credentialing back into our system. So we, again, continue to have office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays for everyone, to make sure that people can come and ask their questions. We know that this is very nuanced, and individual employers want to ask questions about their specific circumstances. So this is an opportunity for them to do that as we look at a big overhaul, a big change in the education policy system that we're trying to initiate with this first step. The other thing I just wanted to quickly touch on is around our programs, at the health and safety for our programs. We continue, as we know that I mentioned at the last, I believe the last emergency meeting, that as the vaccinations for 5 to 11-year-olds are rolling out, we encourage our programs to continue to work with families and make sure that they are facilitating access to those vaccinations. There's resources that we have been providing to our programs to support that, but still continue to require masks for our childcare sites to make sure that we continue to be healthy and safe in our programs during this time. We will continue, and we do work with our health colleagues consistently and making sure that we can readdress and reevaluate any of the policies or update anything as we watch the health landscape as well. So just want to make sure we are noting that. We know that programs have the authority and their policies to reflect their own health and safety policies and their own employee or family handbook that might be suited to their specific community circumstance and community spread. And so we continue to encourage programs to make sure they're using our work as a baseline, but really assessing what their community, what their families, and what their situation is to set appropriate policies. And as contact tracing has moved to the local boards of health and at that level, we encourage them to build those partnerships and are facilitating those partnerships to make sure that we can address each individual case with the kind of intentionality it deserves. With that, I think those are my 2 big updates that aren't necessarily part of the board agenda, and wanted to make sure the board was updated on those, and looking forward to digging in today.
Just one clarifying question, Commissioner. Where are we at with testing? Are the EEC testing sites still open?
Yep, the EEC testing sites are still open, and we still, thank you for asking that, Charlie, so that the other, we still have our testing sites open and are available and for families and staff and children. We also have a pooled testing initiative that we have been working with and have and continue to see programs sign up and are encourage programs to sign up. It is a weekly testing that can cover the whole site, staff and families. So.
Excellent. And certainly, I think, going to be critical through the winter months. We encourage programs in the field to take up the testing part of this strategy. Thank you.
Chair, so can I just ask one more thing, just to for anyone who is curious for the minutes? We actually are still revising the November minutes, given some transition and family paternity leaves on our staff, and so we'll have that out to for review in the next month, in case anyone was wondering about that.
Great.
Time for the next.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. So great, thank you. We'll move to that in January, kind of routine business. So we'll launch right into the agenda and start with the strategic action plan that sort of as an agenda item encompasses the annual report, some of the work on the implementation of the strategic plan, and some of the landscape overall. So we'll launch in now to that first item.
Excellent. So I'm going to start with the annual report. I'll walk through quickly the agenda. When we think about the strategic plan updated as both the content of what we're working with, but also, as you'll remember, when we looked at the strategic plan last summer, in updating it in the new COVID landscape, is the real focus on being able to help us assess what family needs were evolving to be in the new reality. And so really also want to spend some time with you today. Eli will work through what we are learning around that, so to help inform as we look at some of the strategic initiatives that we're undertaking that are responding to the new landscape that we're learning about real time. Then we'll also talk about the strategic initiatives and also give you an update at the end around some of our budget decisions with additional pockets of funding that were provided to EEC this year, so that you all have an update on where those are being dispersed. And for those of you who are not going to show slides today, you have the slides. They're up online for anyone who is not with us at the board meeting and interested. But I think hopefully they're so data heavy that it gave us a chance to really focus on the discussion points as opposed to just reading the data points. To start with the EEC annual report, this is, as Charlotte so pointed out, is the calendar year 2020 report that outlines the legislative requirements from the inception of the department to report on the progress of our work. I want to really point out, and thank you to the board members who prompted some further discussion about what wasn't included in the report. Obviously, this is a legislative requirement, but there's a lot of work that the department is doing that you all hear about or engage with in different ways that isn't necessarily captured in those legislative requirements. So in addition to being able to talk through what's in the report, we also wanted to be able to reference the other things we were doing that weren't necessarily in part of the legislative requirement. And in that, we do provide the materials that we would do the board every month, as well as meet with them monthly with the co-chairs, the education co-chairs in the House and Senate, to make sure that we are answering and updating other questions far beyond this legislative requirement. But what you see here are the metrics that in the report are the things we are required to report on, really looking at the prevalence of behavioral health needs, really thinking right now we're seeing over 2020, it was hard to capture in real time, but I think as we're seeing reflection, this will become an increasingly important metric as we wrap up 2021 as well. But also looking at really the breakdowns of those as demographically, but also the impact of some of those behavioral health needs on how children are able to stay and sustain care despite the challenges despite some challenges. And then also to make sure that we are looking at our comprehensive services, that this report really prompts us to think above and beyond childcare, but in the expansion of services and in the delivery of more comprehensive needs that our populations that we work with really require. We also use this as an opportunity to outline some of the COVID-19 responses that we did, given the fact that this was 2020 and we were trying to be so responsive consistently, and there's, I should say, so much focus from our team was focused on the responsiveness. We wanted to make sure that that was a key part of areas where we might not have seen as much progress on historical metrics, but really we're responding to a much broader set of challenges that our communities were facing. And I also want to point out, I think one of the things that has been an increasing focus for the department is the investment we're making at the community level to bring together all of those services that our families need to be seamless, which there isn't as much of place historically to reflect in the report, but as we look towards 2021, I think that's one area that we want to make sure that even though the report hasn't traditionally focused on that our work is increasingly showing that to be successful on any of this, we need to be able to track that community cohesion and community collaboration, as well as the impact that has on the children. So we are definitely, working to make sure the 2020 report gets in, but also really thoughtful about ways that we might be able to merge some of the strategic plan or strategic action plan and the annual report content going forward, knowing that the timing hasn't always lined up, but we're working one attempt of getting in a strategic action plan update along with the annual report approval is just to really frame the more comprehensive work we're engaged in beyond some of the historical metrics we've tracked. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions, but wanted to give people some context for what was actually in the report itself.
Any comments or questions? Joni, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Thanks. So, Commissioner, I'm glad you explained that because I was one of those people who provided some feedback, and thank you for addressing it. I feel this report gave an unbelievable amount of information, and I think it really dug deep into a lot of the work that EEC is involved in, has been involved in. As you know, my one caveat is that even though we're addressing the needs of families via workforce and programs, what the report does not say is what else families benefited from. And I think we have mounds of data for that. I am very pleased that you addressed it, that we will look into next year, looking at how to merge those, because I think if one reads this legislative report, it doesn't give the breadth and the scope of the work. And if we're keeping families and kids at the center of what we do, I think families who aren't accessing the formal programs, we're not telling the world what we are doing. So I look forward to future reports and ways to integrate some of that work. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, I will say thank you, Joy, for the feedback and also for the continued focus on that. I think one of the biggest challenges I personally have in my role at the department is how to capture the immense amount of work that this staff is involved in every day in a way that doesn't seem so overwhelming when you try to list it out. So you see some attempts in that in this reporting, but definitely look forward to continuing to refine that and yet be holistic in how we are describing our work going forward.
Well, so you're thinking about trying to merge the strategic plan and use that framework seems to me just really excellent, both from an internal leadership and metrics and consistent language, but also actually might accomplish some of this. How do we first capture the broad macro landscape and then fill in some examples and some key progress. So I really like that idea. I also think if you have an actionable strategic plan, you should use it and make sure everybody knows that it's an actionable strategic plan.
Yes.
Good.
And we were very intentional about having it be an actionable plan. So definitely want to feel like we're kind of reporting on multiple ways now. And so
yeah,
as we come through recovery, really making that more comprehensive.
Yeah. Other comments, questions for the commissioner on the annual legislative report? We should all be clear, it's the legislative report, which helps kind of this frame up the tension, if you will, in some ways. Okay. I will make a motion. Secretary, we're forwarding to you. Are you voting on this, even though we're forwarding to you as part of the motion?
I hadn't thought about that. I guess maybe I should abstain. I do promise I will forward it on to the appropriate.
Okay, we appreciate that. All right, I will make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 3G, hereby approves and adopts the annual legislative report for calendar year 2020 and will forward the report to the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Administration and Finance, and the clerks of the House of Representatives and Senate, who shall forward the same to the Joint Committee on Education. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. That's fine. Thank you so much. All right, I'm just going to use my screen. Joni Block.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Paul Del Cito.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Abstain.
Maura Siegel.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Jamela Lee.
Yes.
Thank you. So approved. All right. Many thanks, Commissioner. We can move onward.
So I want to spend the bulk of this time in our landscaping or our update analysis to talk about the update that we've been hearing from the engagement with the business community. But I wanted to highlight quickly just some of where that fits into our overall process. You have a slide on slide 6 for anyone following along at home that really looks across our pillars and highlights some of the key initiatives that are either underway or launched to help achieve the action steps that we outlined in the strategic action plan. And so I will highlight very quickly those, but I will then turn it over to Eli to talk much more deeply around what we are hearing from the business community in particular, knowing that that is such a critical factor in how we support families and what kind of support families will need going forward. So obviously with our, conversation around, I'll walk through pillar by pillar, the conversation that we've had around our objectives for children, youth, and families. You'll hear a little bit more today about the work started with the subsidy system that you all had voted on with the parent fee. Certainly that, as we have been discussing, is one step towards really rethinking our subsidy system in terms of revised regulations and other components that would follow from implementation of the new parent fee structure. This is obviously something that has become a little bit more fluid through COVID, as we have been really pushing our subsidy policies to be much more responsive to the family landscape, which is where, as we've looked forward to understanding the business community, the future of work, and what kinds of structures families might, what kinds of structures, different demographics of families might be working under is a key component to be able to help drive what kind of revisions would be needed in a subsidy structure to make sure childcare could be affordable and accessible to families. In addition, obviously, this is where identifying parents' needs. You'll hear more about this today. And as I referenced in the annual report, the third thing that we've really started the annual report discussion, the third thing that we've really dug deep in behind the scenes at this point is learning from our new funding that have complemented both the CFCE work, our CPPI work, and through summer step up and the likes, to really help define not only that we have access to affordable services for families, but also to really define how that becomes accessible through no wrong door strategies, where everyone knows enough about what's available in the community that we can come together to support families in the trajectory of their children's first years of life. Then obviously we've talked a lot about, and just harkening back so you understand how these things we've been talking about really do connect to our strategic action plan, that our educators and our programs, obviously we've done a significant amount of work this year to launch and learn along the way so far in developing the registry and the workforce policies, and beginning to transition away from the current system towards a more competency-based approach. And we'll talk about, and we think about the budget this year, additional opportunities that we see for piloting and thinking through some of those. But that also that is coupled with this types of not only a system to support educators, but also the kinds of robust professional supports that educators need to really hone in their knowledge and competency and professional trajectory. And so we have launched, as you have seen, and there's some notes in the appendix on this particularly, professional pathways that helps potential candidates get connected with those higher ed and professional coursework they need to achieve the hiring, the requirements to be a teacher in a childcare provider, and then also working with our community colleges. You've seen the data on that, of where we're really trying to work and make sure we're prioritizing access for our potential candidates and students and workforce in the field, as well as looking at our Smart Start system, which is the learning management system, in which we have online training, some of which required. We were revising and continue to really hone that strategy as well, in response to some of what we saw through COVID, including more mental health supports like the pyramid model on that, so they were more accessible, and really leveraging that platform, that online learning management platform, to reach more professionals, particularly as we recruit new people into the field who may not have as much access to training during this time of virtual learning for adults too. Then, of course, we'll talk deeply today around the stabilization grants and the childcare as we move to support operations, and really thinking about how we have both invested financially, given this the federal funding, as well as trying to provide some supports for people to use those dollars wisely around operational sustainability during this time of fluctuation and change. And then obviously have worked deeply to think through how we define continuous quality improvement, what supports are needed, and as we have transitioned away from the old QRIS, exactly to learn from those pilots and initiatives, and some of the ones Joni was referencing that we have launched, to make sure that we're refining and responsive to the new needs of programs as they are responding to the new needs of families. And then obviously our system, I won't belabor that part, but we've made a number of investments in technology. You have all seen some of the revised organizational structure. In the coming months, you'll see some of our plans for expansion of staff. And then also have been really working on the data analytics capacity so that we can bring data regularly, discuss it, and being able to use that to drive our decision making, which leads to how some of the new data that we're looking to try to understand around the changes in business and workforce. So you have there sort of the large capture, but as you can see, all of these pillars are dependent on what the landscape that EEC stakeholders and families, educators, programs, all of our constituents are really working and engaging in. So I wanted to give a chance for Eli to talk through deeply. We've spent the last months very deep in conversation, as promised, I think in July, as we started to launch this work, really trying to listen and understand what was driving decisions. We spent a lot of time with data from the Labor and Workforce Development Secretariat, and trying to be able to match not just what are the needs of of families, but now leading us down the path more granularly of in what regions, what kind of magnitude, and really understanding how we design a system that can be responsive, not only to families, but to the structures that families are functioning in, so that we can set families up for success in work, get them back to work. But it's very hard if you don't have the kinds of appropriate care. And one of the gaps childcare has long struggled with is how to capture family needs to be able to design a system that actually can be responsive to it. There's a national problem, we've all talked about it, but I think one of the things that's very difficult is to know the dynamics by which families are making choices, because that, we very much want to honor family choice, but it's hard to understand how many families will have grandma move into the state next year and it changed their childcare needs. So starting to pick apart those key dynamics that are driving family choices has been our approach, to try to build some estimates of what kinds of innovation or what kinds of capacity we'll need, and how much and what areas we should be driving innovation specifically, or incentivizing it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eli to talk about the specifics, and happy to answer questions as we go.
Thank you, Commissioner. So as the Commissioner shared, we have worked for many months and before that even across secretariats and with external business coalition partners to consult with and survey hundreds of employers who each of them together represent tens of thousands of employees in the Commonwealth. And as we are continuing to think about childcare infrastructure, as we think about innovation and the types and the models of care, we wanted to ensure that we had a really strong foundational understanding of how the needs of working families might change in the coming months and years. And we knew that to build that understanding, we needed to hear directly from the business community, and that we wanted to understand from them how their policies might be changing, what kinds of supports they might be providing for their employees, and how they could help us zero in on what their employees' childcare needs might look like in the future of work. So that's where we started, and we have learned just an incredible wealth of knowledge around how things might be changing and what we might see across all different workforce segments. And so as we spoke, we started to kind of coalesce or understand that we were hearing two primary themes, one around access and the other around affordability, which we all know are incredibly interconnected, but different things for each category. So when we talked with employers about access to care, they really focused on available care, so having enough supply of care for their workforce, as well as flexibility. They anticipated that in the future of work, their employees are going to need more care. They're hoping to have more employees as they grow their work, and that their employees will need different models for sporadic care or drop-in care as those hybrid work schedules become more common. For employees who don't work a traditional schedule or who have shift schedules, needs for more early morning and evening care, for care that can adapt to the needs of those with unpredictable schedules, that their employees might be looking for care closer to home rather than work, as they might have in the past. So just across any number of dimensions, that there will be a need to sort of stay connected to the business community, to their employees, and understand where those things are headed. The second theme around affordability was nearly universal and echoed by our engagement directly with families. And the focus on affordability came really across all workforce segments and all income levels for their employees. So we heard about, or they are hearing the parents that they wish to hire talking about having to weigh the salary that they might receive from their employer with the cost of care and what that means for that employee's choice to join the workforce or not. They talked about many workforce segments where the household income is just above the entry point for publicly subsidized care, but still really struggle with the cost of care. And then these findings were supplemented with one-to-one conversations with leaders across multiple industries many of them shared that they are worried about recruiting the workforce for their future. So they talked about their projections for industry growth, worries that they would have difficulty recruiting candidates to Massachusetts to grow their work, talking about some of the frontline positions that they're building that earn a strong wage, but still would struggle with affordable care as they grow that part of their work. As we understood these themes and we talked with employers about what they're doing in order to address the concerns that their employees are sharing, what we heard is that they are not always sure exactly what approach will be the most helpful. They have, the vast majority have talked about increased flexibility as their primary method of addressing their employees' care needs. And a segment of them have actually put financial investments towards that purpose, whether flexible spending accounts or their own sort of company subsidies in some cases. But that was a relatively small part of those with whom we spoke. And what we understood from them is that it has been difficult to actually zero in on the right method, or to think about what resources as companies they had available to them to actually support that. So that kind of represents or summarizes our engagement with the business community. We wanted to also supplement that with research into where changes are coming in the labor market. The Commonwealth has an incredible resource in the Future of Work report that has a wealth of data to help us understand that. But we also wanted to look at our own, pursue kind of our own research inquiry to understand specific geographies and specific workforce segments and where the greatest kind of growth potential for the labor market might be, and how that helps us understand growth in childcare infrastructure to meet that need. And we've just begun this research, but what we understand so far is that, as we all know, there is a significant gap in terms of labor supply in order to meet labor demand across the country, but also in Massachusetts. And the greatest area for growth that we could tap into is actually with mothers of young children, where only 66% of mothers of children 0 to 5 are in the labor market, compared to 93% of those who identify as fathers. So as you can imagine, thinking about that particular segment, childcare is critical and essential in order to ensure that those families, that we can maximize the potential of those mothers to re-engage in the labor market. So Commissioner, please feel free to add anything, but otherwise I will turn back to you.
Yeah, I'm very happy to, thank you so much, Eli, and very happy to take questions. Just honing in on sort of some of the stepping back, the macro here is that as we've talked to employers, the need to recruit workforce has been critical, and that the need for childcare supports to be able to recruit that workforce has become very paramount in those conversations, and that as we've looked at the demographics, and this certainly lines up with demographics and conversations we've been having with Labor and Workforce Development Secretariat that has been doing similar data analysis, is that the potential to be able to recruit workforce is really with women and women who are likely mothering age is a huge area. And so then being able to, as Eli alluded to, our next steps of being able to really understand industries and industry needs, as well as distribution of families across the state, will help us be able to match some of our childcare innovation and childcare sustainability strategies with the areas and the demographics that might be impacted most to support people getting back to work. I just want to hone in on just one more thing that Eli mentioned, I want to make sure is really highlighted, is that when we talk about the access to care, the affordability we can unpack, and as Eli pointed out, we hear businesses say a lot that they have made as many strategies as they could on their own, but that as the interplay between access and affordability is really key as the future of work changes, that they are going to need access to care in places that traditionally they didn't. So places that have traditionally had central offices downtown that maybe have more remote work, where they may have relied on a Bright Horizons as a staff strategy, may not work in the same way when they have people distributed around the state as opposed to in one location. And that there are many industries that traditionally hadn't really been served by our childcare: overnight care, early morning care, evening care, things that were more challenged already, where they're seeing a more desperate need to be able to recruit workforce and think about some of those infrastructure needs, which aren't necessarily, I'll say it's not that Massachusetts hasn't figured this out. This is a gap in the childcare infrastructure across the country that everyone's talking about, that as we're hearing the needs from employers, they're becoming even more important for us to figure out how do we incentivize different strategies there. So you have the macro or the immense amount of data that Eli said, but kind of honing in on some of the things that EEC is taking back and trying to process real time as we think about this. Happy to answer questions or thoughts or
Sheila, go ahead.
Thank you. Commissioner, I wonder, have you noticed any effect on affordability due to the shortages in labor? I would think, you know, childcare centers and providers would or certainly the centers would have to maybe increase tuitions or think about getting rates up in order to attract staff.
Yep. Yeah, and I think, thank you for that question. And yes, I think we have been honing in through our grant, which we'll talk about in the next section, as much information as we could get around exactly that question. And we are seeing a number of programs who have increased rates for families in order to do just that, afford staffing models. And it's a huge concern as we try to tackle this affordability question for sure. And knowing that in programs that don't have the ability to do that, that it is also then having an impact on their capacity to serve families because they're not able to recruit the staff they need. So the interconnectedness of the components of the system here, I think, make it a very big challenge to figure out where is the best infrastructure, the best enhancements to EEC's work to help both balance, you know, the existing work we have been needed for, and also the new innovation that the Commonwealth's requiring as we recover from the pandemic.
Well, so just picking up on that, you know, if you think about the sort of dynamics of supply and demand, right? It's very hard to imagine there's any one lever to pull, for starters. Now, that's not like a revelation by any stretch. On the other hand, it paints such a more complex picture because of the shuffle on both sides, right? The schedules, the lack of commute. I can honestly, anecdotally think of 3 people who gave up their Bright Horizons spots because they're no longer driving in and out, right? You would never drive to have care. But so it has had me thinking that in some ways, in the same way that we've sort of said, this is a system that we want to sort of move off of thinking about building in terms of one slot or one child at a time. In some ways, this scenario takes that to a whole different level, which is, how do we support families rather than get focused on delivering childcare per se? It's kind of interesting, you know, it might not be I may not be articulating it really well, but it starts to have you thinking less about the employer putting a Bright Horizons in the building or paying for some kind of arrangement. It gets you thinking more about care and sort of subsidies for care at the level of the family that's going to probably put together some fairly fluid kinds of arrangements more and more. That's less about the fluid arrangements at the level of Allison and her colleagues when she was at Children's having odd hours. off hours, early starts, et cetera, than more just a workforce that is working in more flexible and dynamic ways and is no longer at all location specific in a lot of respects. So sort of thinking about that piece overall.
Yeah.
And Noni, building on that, it's like how could we facilitate families recognizing that they are in maybe a geographic locale together to organize
That's
care?
right.
They might not otherwise know how to find each other to almost drive what it is they need in this changed environment.
Well, that's the thing, right? Is you start to think about the ways in which you're actually putting slots together rather than thinking about slots as confounded with individual children's in one end of, at one end of the example or the continuum, right?
I think also, though, to be sure we take into consideration the characteristics of different parent groups. For example, the cohort of parents who rely on subsidized childcare often support workers in the service industries. Those people aren't going to be working from home.
Exactly.
Right, but their jobs have also changed, and it's curious to see how the shift work. Shift work has also changed. I think Eli may have some data, may not, but certainly if you read some of the analytics from the business community, like even the service delivery shifts have changed, some of the EMS. So it's very interesting in that way. There's this dynamic kind of change. And certainly the pandemic literature would suggest lots of that won't go back to baseline, right?
Right. I think my point was they'll be working less from home than some other workers.
Sure. But I think the flexibility and some of the churn at the level of just the work itself is across sectors. And
Sure.
I will just say the data on that is, I think, is exactly that, is that both sides of the equation have changed. Those that can work from home have different hours and needs and in different locations. And those that can't have often needed different hours prior to the pandemic, and now is even more so as industries shift to be able to accommodate the entire population. Sorry, Joni, did you want to?
Joni, sorry, I missed your hand. Go right ahead.
That's okay. I'm right here.
It kind of blends in with your beautiful poster. Sorry, the yellow.
That's true. It does. I just am noticing that. I think, Eli, what you talked about in terms of the affordability and access issues have always been two huge issues. The third, if I can quote from a colleague's leg of the stool, is the quality leg that we also have to address. And this is more of a rhetorical question, but I think it must remain in the forefront. When we're dealing with these issues, these social issues and health issues that we've been dealing with for the past almost 2 years, right? I am wondering what, in terms of access, how might families access early childhood programs based on the needs of their kids? So right away, we want something that's accessible, that meets the schedule, meets the geographic location. But we certainly know the mental health issues are tremendous, not only among our adult workers, but among the kids. Children with disabilities or other challenges, English language learners or dual language learners, as the term is. And how are families able to access programs that address that is something that I think we're all grappling with. It's not, as you had said, Noni, it's not just a spot that we're looking at. We're looking at the right spot, one that really meets those needs.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, Julie, I think one of the questions, well, two questions we're having. One is, how are parents actually making decisions is something we've been working with Bipartisan Policy Center on, to do deep analysis of different industries that are driving parent decision-making, as well as parents themselves, to understand, like, across the demographics, how are they deciding this? And I think, early on, the reason why we asked them to do a Massachusetts specific analysis, because they had done some national analyses during COVID that showed that that parents were making decisions based on different things than they did prior to COVID. And even though we were seeing uptakes of family childcare, parents were nationally showing an interest in getting back to center-based care because of health and safety concerns. And we're seeing that play out in different ways. So really to get some analysis to help build that. I think, Joni, that interplays with quality matters. We can talk about quality from an academic perspective, but if we're going to have parents choose quality, it's got to resonate for them and meet their needs. And I think that's where we're trying to unpack the quality conversation a little bit more. What we don't want to do is to say to a family, for example, who's working overnight, that you get left out of a high quality educational experience for your 3 or 4-year-old during the day because you need overnight care. And the quality of what is happening overnight has to look very different than the quality of what has to happen between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. or whatever hours that might be. And really unpacking that so that we can be driven by family choice and make sure they have access to all the services they need to provide a robust quality experience for their young children, and not just sort of have them have an option to go to one, but then have to sacrifice what might be a really, important component of care that they need for their child so that they can go to work. And so those balances, I think, are really for the next year. Where we need numbers associated with that, and going back to Chair Lasso's question, is that it's great to say we have a family that needs that, but we need to start to aggregate about what kind of numbers we would see so we can build the access so that it does start to be a resource for families, and not, it's very hard to do with 1 million families on a one-by-one basis, but start to sort of build around options for families so they can access the things that will help them succeed. Sorry, that was a little long, but I wanted to unpack the quality part specifically.
No, and I do think it's really important to name in the context of this conversation that the mixed delivery system has always been a strength in Massachusetts, through to, even to Joni's point, some of the informal, community-based programming that actually is part of the continuum of care and early education. So it's entirely right to have this kind of conversation as part of the access conversation. Maura.
Eli, this data is fantastic, and I keep reading it through the question of relative emphasis on what's important for employers. And I think as I piece together a lot of these data points, it wouldn't be too far of a stretch, but this is a check me, Commissioner Eli team, to say, like, the theme coming out of this is that, like, the single most important thing that we can do to improve my ability to hire and retain talent to fuel my business is to strengthen the childcare system in Massachusetts. Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, where are they putting their pennies most? And is it, like, relative to all of this? I mean, a lot needs to improve in society all the time, but I am pulling out of this sort of a relative, this is like the thing that's going to be a catalyst for my business now and into the future? Question mark. How would you confirm that? I mean,
I will say that we heard, I'll say it in 2 ways, Maura, is that one, we heard, and Eli can jump in, I think we heard from business that this was one of their top concerns. So yes, I think in there, whether it is their only concern or the most priority for everyone, I think we haven't necessarily gotten to that level of granularity, but certainly that this was a top concern. And I think that I would say it's not only, I certainly, from EEC's perspective, feel like this is the most important thing we can do. And however, I also think that what we heard from business was not only that this was important, but that it was there was urgency to it, that maybe, housing or other strategies that they saw for workforce development had a long-term game. There was some urgency and some initial investments and strategies that we should be deploying that would have a quicker impact and start in being able to think through recovery. So Eli, I don't know if there's more from that.
The only thing I would add is that they are looking at it as an economic priority. For them, it's about economic growth, economic sustainability.
So if you were both to, engage in an advisory conversation at this point, like based on this research, what two things might you latch onto in all of this? Thinking about the here and the now, but also the systems building. Like what floats up for you? I don't mean to, like, I'm not putting you on the spot necessarily, but just if you had to sort of say right now, like, what are you latching onto?
Yeah, and I think it starts to address how we frame the meeting today too, which is why this felt like a pertinent initial framing conversation, is really we need to think about not only sustaining current infrastructure, but actually incentivizing different kinds of infrastructure if we're really going to be able to build the kind of supports that businesses need. And that that is not the only component, that the infrastructure is part of it, but addressing really complex dynamics around affordability are really pertinent too. And I think that's complex. It's both complex in that we've done some things over COVID to try to help. We are working on our subsidy system, but the country doesn't really have a model of how to, build expansion to subsidies beyond the federal footprint. And so we're also really thinking about, what are strategies? Like a federal footprint says, which we've maxed out in Massachusetts, that you can offer subsidies to families 85% of the state median income or below. They have to be working or have a service need of some kind. And so we've maxed all of those out. But I think what we're hearing is that we should be more innovative and creative in trying to think differently, not just about subsidizing a family, but actually building the kind of multiple strategy approach that would address affordability across the kinds of recruitment that businesses need to do, but also across the kind of strategies that we just talked that families are using, informal care, preschool, overnight care, all of those kind of questions as well. So I think that's what we've started to really, again, like framing the board meeting today of understanding for an infrastructure conversation and sustaining infrastructure, of looking at our operational grants, understanding the data and understanding that investment as a huge opportunity, knowing that we're not yet quite there of understanding it, driving all of the innovation in infrastructure we would need, but we can't take any steps back in the meantime, while also starting to think, at least within our subsidies, affordability. And I think our next step is to really think, what else should we be doing to engage as we revise our subsidy structure as a whole over the next year?
I think the commissioner has covered this, but just to emphasize that what we also understand is that things will continue to change, and we need room for agility within our infrastructure to continue to evolve as that change continues.
Well, that's partly why this kind of the systems building and the sort of trying to think about churn at supply and demand and how you might solve for that. Paul.
Eli, I was going to say a similar thing, and it's such a moment in time. It'd be so interesting to continue to leverage the partnership with these groups. A lot of companies and employers had envisioned bringing people back right around now and have now paused those plans. And, people have had to readjust schedules once again. And so the fluidity of this work as it relates to the workforce as well is just ever changing. And so how do we keep up on this really robust, good information so that we can see where people are? Because, you just pull up the local news today, you'll see a lot of Massachusetts companies that have hit pause on bringing people back in a hybrid way. And so that's a big change for families.
Yeah, I think we have to remember too, when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about state agencies that manage this huge amount of growth and development. And, once we achieve additional accessibility, what are our oversight responsibilities and what capacity do we have to do that? So let's not forget us too.
Yeah, and I think, Sheila, this is the question, is what is our role in that, right? Like, are we actually the delivery of services the way a school district delivers services, or are we a facilitator of innovative, business models or incentivizer? And I think this is a key question for us going forward is, what are, to use Charlie So's terminology, what are the levers we should be pulling as a state agency with a very specific sector we're responsible for?
Yeah, and you think about it, you know, it's very, to my mind, you want to think about, you know, where's the value add at the state level, aside from obviously running operations and administering subsidies, et cetera. In my view, sort of thinking about this moment and leadership team and the overall conditions and context, the value add is to try to articulate the infrastructure that the childcare would plug into, right? And that we would have a better sense, for example, of how to advise and support communities, essential workers, specific populations on how they plug into what is a childcare system that is a mix of private and public. But I think as a departure, maybe, Sheila, from decades past, I might argue this is the moment to articulate that architecture with the universal in mind, rather than start with serving populations, right? It's a slightly different way of going at it. It's also already in motion. I'm not suggesting there's a blank canvas, but I think some of the design principles at the level of the universal we've never necessarily addressed from a state perspective, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think this is, you know, key questions. I think as we look at the next couple of conversations we hope to have today, is I think one of the key questions we were trying to piece the data to. Let me say this. We have very limited data to piece together currently and are trying to build real time, is how do we match that infrastructure with the conversation we're having about parent need and assess real time if we built the right kind of thing, right? I mean, right now we're talking about sustaining infrastructure. We know enrollment's low. We know that there are challenges for families having nothing to do with childcare in enrolling. And we're trying to sustain and make sure we don't take steps back. But over time, we need to make sure that that infrastructure is even something families want. And if not, redeploy to something that would actually support families. And that's going to take a whole new analysis, whole new collection of data, and a whole new way of real time looking at data so that we can make sure that we are as responsive as possible. And we've never looked at, for example, overall family enrollment in childcare. It's not a system we have to build, but if we're going to see if we have the right infrastructure, that's a key data point to be able to assess the efficacy of it.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you, Eli. Thanks so much. Look forward to continued conversation for sure.
Excellent. So the next conversation we wanted to have today, I was just looking at this, is around our operational grants specifically. So I will give a little bit of context and then hand it over to Jocelyn to talk specifically through the slides around the data we're seeing. But as I just referenced, a lot of the things we want to assess in from the programs that are receiving our operational grants are things that we don't collect or have a data lens into. And so we made the intentional choice in launching the grants to ask for minimal data on a monthly basis to keep the burden on programs very low in being able to access the dollars, but instead to do an occasional survey that would provide us the trend data that we needed to learn from in order to understand the impact of these grants and the formula, and also to be able to talk to our colleagues across secretariats and the legislature about what kinds of trends we were seeing in childcare, and so it writ large. And so we did, with the big caveat that this was, we did as much as we could, and we did had to have a cutoff line so we could analyze it and get it in front of you. So we still do are collecting from a few more programs along the way, but felt that we had enough saturation to be able to get some of this data. So the other thing I know, and I'm just going to say this right out loud because there was some pushback on being able to collect some of this information information around enrollment of private pay families. And we did not require that anyone put the information in if they were not comfortable. And so you do have that note here. Not all programs responded to that. We felt like we got enough data to have some meaningful points to talk about. But this is a question that I am asked probably 17 to 18 times a day, which is what's our utilization of childcare overall? And to be able to really make the point that we are an infrastructure that families are utilizing, this data is a really important point for us to be able to do, even if it is on estimates and the best knowledge of the programs and not perfect. And so that's what you have here, and some of the utilization and information. And I'll hand it over to Jocelyn to talk about what we're learning, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do with that information as we look through the next 6 months.
And I need to find my mute button. Thank you, Commissioner. The eternal search. So as the Commissioner mentioned, I did want to share some information and update you on where in the engagement with the operational grant stand, and also some of the information that we're learning from the survey that we've put out to the field. Just as an update, we have now about 80% of our eligible programs engaged with the funding at this point. We've put out $150 million to programs, and we find that about 65% of the funding is being distributed to programs that are serving subsidized children. When we dig in a little bit more closely to who is coming in for this, we do find that FCC programs are coming in at slightly higher rates than center-based, although that gap is closing. I think we saw a lot of FCCs come in very quickly right in the beginning, and center-based programs in some cases took longer to submit grants. And just as a reminder, programs can submit at any point in time, and a program could submit its first application this month going back to July. So there was some flexibility in terms of when programs were able to apply. We do see that the take-up is higher across all program types in gateway cities, those in high SVI areas, and those that are serving children with subsidies. And this is true for both center-based and FCC programs. When we look at how the percentage of funding received relates to the percentage of the market each type of program reflects, we see the same patterns reflected in the amount of funding that programs are receiving. And when we look at the amount of funding that programs are receiving per slot, so just as a brief reminder, there's a standard per slot payment that is the base for the formula. So every program is paid the same amount per licensed slot, but there's 2 multipliers that factor into the formula. So programs that there's a multiplier based on the number of staff per licensed slot, and then there's an equity multiplier for programs located either in high SVI communities or programs that are serving high percentages of subsidized children. So when you look at the total grant award, you can recalculate it per slot, and you get different numbers depending on the program's actual formula. And we do see—
Jocelyn, sorry to interrupt. You've got a question in the chat about which slide you're at. And so maybe you can just help the board.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm whipping through.
That was
no, you're good.
Yeah, that was slide 16 that she was just going through. So you can go from there.
Yeah, I'm there. So I went through, I sort of summarized 14 and 15 in one take. And now I'm looking at 16, which shows the breakdown by slide.
Thank you.
And those adjustments were designed to try to reflect some differences in the costs that we would expect programs to have. And particularly the staffing adjustment was designed to reflect the difference in cost for programs serving infants and toddlers. And one thing that you do see here is that programs that are serving infants and toddlers are getting a higher per slot payment. The equity adjustment also looks like it's functioning as intended, in the programs that are in high SVI communities and serving children receiving subsidies are receiving higher per slot payments. So turning to slide 17 and looking at the insights from the operational grant survey, we did have to pull the data on November 27th, which was when we had about 90% of programs having responded to the survey, and can certainly update numbers in future meetings if we need to. But overall, I think this is giving us a good insight into how programs are spending the money and some of the nuances of staffing and enrollment challenges that they're facing. First of all, just calling out that 90% of programs report using funding immediately to sustain operations. And when you look at how the funding is, each sort of the average grant budget is being spent within programs, you see that on average programs are spending about 3/4 of their grant on current operational costs. So that might be past expenses that they are allowed to reimburse themselves for per ARPA regulations. It's current payroll and other current costs like facility costs and other standing operational costs that programs have. There is about a third of budgets on average that are going into increases. So adding training for staff, increases in compensation and one-time in salaries and one-time bonuses. When you look at how that is distributed across all programs, you find that about 27% of programs report investing grants in salary increases. So I think in this picture, you can start to see how programs are trying to balance the ongoing need for continuous support on their operational side, with also the desire to address some of the challenges that they're facing, both in terms of the loss of revenue, but also some of the staffing challenges that we will talk about a little bit more in a minute. And I think overall, 94% of programs do report that they need to continue to receive these grants over the next 3 months to sustain operations. So programs are not yet out of some of the operational challenges that they faced. And when you look at enrollment numbers, I think you can see why that might be, that enrollment numbers are still down, although they have been growing over the time that the grant has been in place. Additionally, I think just one thing to flag, we do have 11% of programs that suggest that they are in danger of closing in the next 6 months if funding doesn't continue. And not surprisingly, that does correlate with lower enrollment.
Maura, do you have a question that you wanted to raise?
Well, I would love to know what is your reaction to the data on 27%, what you expected, what, what's the interpretation on that data set?
I think it's reflective of the fact that when programs do have the opportunity to invest increased salaries, there's a strong need and desire for programs to increase salaries for educators. And I'll look at some of this data in a little further on, but I mean, I think we all recognize that salaries are on the low side in this field, and programs are facing pretty significant staffing shortages that they do need to address, and increasing salaries is one way to do it. But at the same time, I think, it's a third of the programs currently using this grant funding, and I think it reflects a couple of concerns. One, that this funding short-term, so programs are reluctant to invest in salaries with funding that's not long-term and something that they can expect to sustain those salaries in the future. I think it also just reflects that there are differences in the extent to which programs really need this funding to cover gaps in their revenue and don't yet have the flexibility in their budget to invest in salaries.
I would just add to that, Jocelyn, I would say this is probably on par to what we expected, about a third, given all the dynamics that Jocelyn just laid out of, knowing that so many programs have revenue gaps that they were already grappling with, that taking on additional expenses is difficult, but that many programs, to Sheila's earlier point, were having to make salary increases just to retain and sustain and recruit staff. That, I don't think this is, I think this is maybe slightly higher than I personally expected, Jocelyn, but not significantly. We knew some programs had also taken on this risk, had raised philanthropic dollars, had been able to, what Jocelyn pointed out, have been able to raise revenue elsewhere, and so knew that that was something that they that some programs were undertaking. So Jocelyn, feel free to add color to that, but that would be my take.
Also, can I just ask, what was the response rate? Was it 100% or to the survey?
90%, roughly, 87.
87, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
At this point, we do have more that have come in since then, but we haven't put in this analysis.
Yeah, it was. This was the response we had at the point we pulled it.
Just thinking aloud constructively, anything, and maybe this is for another day, but I was trying to think in the short run, anything we can, in terms of problem solving for those smaller programs that feel very much in danger of closing. I just wanted to flag, obviously, there may be ways they can work with the agency. There may be also that it's for such a multitude of reasons, and fragility pre-pandemic or the business model, but just wanted to name that I see that 11% and see that there's small programs and small numbers matter a great deal when it comes to children and families.
Yeah, and particularly thinking about the dynamic we just discussed, which is organized for smaller programs.
That's right.
I think, and Jocelyn can correct me if I miscategorize this, but I think this is something we've been really interested in trying to dig into much deeper too, is what is the dynamic of those small programs? How we know that in many cases, it's our larger programs that are accepting subsidies. So how does that dynamic play out with some of what we'll need in smaller communities in terms of sustaining them? And we do not have this data yet, but I think one of the things Jocelyn and I have discussed trying to get deeper into is understanding the dynamic between parent fee, parent tuition, subsidy, program size, and location, and how that's impacting salary and staffing, obviously, and revenue and expenses. So, you know, it's complex and we don't have great data, but trying to call what we can to try to answer some more nuanced questions is how I would describe where we are now.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, it's great that you're thinking about it. And, you know, this sort of goes back to our retreat conversations, but, you know, in some ways they have the greatest fixed costs, right? I mean, the fixed cost for the small program is really tough. The larger programs that take subsidies, that may be driving down some of the in a comparison model, they may have lower per capita fixed costs, right? Ultimately, that need to come out of their cash flow. It's interesting to think about.
Exactly. And less economies of scale when you're
talking. And when you're right. And so to circle back to this conversation about systems building and responding to a new era of care, right? This sort of operational model that isn't so tied to the individual child, there's some sort of funding structure that thinks about starting with just general fixed costs, whether you're going to open the door for 4 kids or 90, right? It seems like has to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think the other piece, and you can look at slide 18 for a summary of this, but it is also understanding enrollment and the differences in enrollment across programs. I mean, this shows that the enrollment has increased over time, but larger programs still have lower enrollment. One question that I was asked when I showed this to somebody was like, well, but let's look at, you know, have the smaller programs that weren't able to enroll just had to close while the larger programs could sustain operations without shutting down? That's certainly, I think, something we could dig into. We could also look to see if there is what the geographic variation is in these enrollment and percentages across programs, because there likely are differences as well. I mean, back to the earlier point, you know, that we know that the Boston-centric model is probably not being upheld in the same way that it might have been when people are commuting into Boston.
Right.
But overall, I think we are also seeing that that when we look at the survey data, where we have a slightly more nuanced data on part-time and full-time, the numbers in the figure are probably slightly inflated, because if you adjust for part-time enrollment, just as an estimate, you end up finding that programs are at about, on average, 68% enrolled. So it's hard to know exactly what the significance for a particular program's revenue is from their enrollment numbers without the nuances of, you know, sort of how many hours are families and children enrolling for, what are they actually paying for. The other piece to this dynamic is that 19% of programs are telling us that they're unable to serve their license capacity. And one of the primary drivers of this is staffing reduction. So effectively, programs are closing classrooms because they don't have the staff to staff those classrooms. And then that reduces the number of children that they are able to enroll below their license capacity. And then if we look at the ways in which programs are managing the revenue challenges, so this is moving on to slide 19, but trying to understand what is happening with programs' tuition decisions. It's an interesting picture, because we see that, you know, 62% of programs have not surprisingly raised tuition either recently or plan to in the near future. And, you know, 42% of them seem to be showing a regular pattern of tuition raises. They raised it last year, they're going to raise it again this year, but there is a small number of programs that have not raised tuition in many years and don't plan to. And these tend to be programs serving many families from very low income households, which is also not surprising, but I do think it calls out a segment of our market whereby their ability to manage revenue loss through tuition increases is pretty limited. And just to give a sense of the demographics in these programs, based on the information that we had reported, we have salary information on about 80% of enrolled children. a little over 60% are under 100,000. And then as reported, we have about 25% over 100,000, although I think it's probably fair to say that a significant number of the missing 20% probably fall in that higher income range as well. 42% of children with BIPOC heritage and 22% that are dual language learners. So this is a field that is, providing significant support to low-income families, and these challenges are real for programs. And primary in the challenge is this issue of balancing the need to invest in staff while also not increasing tuition above rates which parents can't afford and pricing out the market. And that's a place where I think we see that programs are really trying to balance the budget and struggling to figure out how to put the pieces together, but also a place where some of the information we have suggests that the operational grant is supporting programs in being able to put these pieces together and sustain operations and make some small differences potentially in staff salaries and their ability to hire staff. So first of all, I'm now on slide 20. Just as baseline, 69% of programs report that they have open educators positions, and this averages about 3 positions per program. And if you add together the number of positions that programs report being filled and the number of open positions they have, this reflects about 12% of program staffing needs for classrooms. And this it seems to be relatively consistent across communities. There are no obvious trends by community types. It's pretty much statewide. And when you look, I'm going to jump briefly to slide 21 and come back, but when you look at where our salaries currently are, we see that they do, for many educators, continue to hover around minimum wage. This table shows you the percentages of different types of programs that meet certain salary thresholds. So if you're looking for these numbers to add up to 100%, just to be clear, they don't, they're cumulative as you go up. But in general, you can see here that those programs in the highest SVI and those serving children with subsidies do tend to have lower wages across the board. When we look at the information that programs provided, the salaries that they were reporting across the months of the grant application, so the report on the high and the low salaries for all their different roles, we see that about 19% of programs do indicate some kind of a wage increase between July and November. But the changes are small, as best we can tell, around $1 an hour, often less. And often the programs that do report increasing wages were those that started with the lowest wages in July. So programs do seem to be trying to adjust.
Interesting.
But I think, so the range of motion that they have is limited. We are also interested in understanding the benefits that programs are providing and define benefits pretty broadly in the questionnaire. So, 90% of programs indicate they provide some kind of benefits, but the most common are paid vacation time and paid sick time. When you look at some of the more costly benefits like health insurance, around 60% of programs provide health insurance or retirement benefits. And it also, we didn't ask by role. So it is unclear, is that just that they're providing this to the director or these benefits that are available to the entire staff? So that's another area I think we do want to pay attention to, and also another area that programs can focus attention on in thinking about how to attract staff. And finally, in just placing family childcare in this picture, 38% of family childcare providers responding to the grant report that they do employ an assistant, and assistant hours seem to be growing slightly between the reports from July to now, but it's a small change. So, it's still, I think, also important to recognize that the FCC field is dominated by single operator programs, where it's one person with a group of children working in her home. So looking back on slide 20 and how programs are using the grant funds to support compensation, half of the centers report using the funds in some way to support compensation costs, either the current costs or additional increases in one-time compensation or in salaries. And when you look at how programs structure their grant budgets, about 30% of those funds on average go to those costs. And 27% of programs do plan to use the funds for longer term salary increases. And I think that we do see that programs recognize the need for increases and the desiring increases in the fact that 70% of them do say they plan to increase salaries by the end of the fiscal year. And there's an additional 30% that plan to do so by the end of next calendar year. So a significant number of programs really are looking for ways to increase salaries. And one other interesting point, just in sort of the dynamic between enrollment and staffing, we do see that actually when you look at the staffing adjustment, the average number of educators per licensed slot is actually slightly increasing, maybe by almost up to about half of an FTE by what would be sort of a typical preschool classroom. But at the same time, we also see the total number of classrooms are decreasing over time. So there is some signs of consolidation going on in the field, likely in response to both the staffing shortages and the enrollment restrictions.
You know, I just want to step back and call out big picture, just how important it is to get these data to do the kind of work that we were just talking about, right? I mean, until, and it's not going to be perfect, and it takes a lot of, you know, it's a lot of change in some ways. It's sort of a change process to become more data driven, not just as an agency, but to inculcate a kind of culture of data. And over time, it'll be really important to figure out also how EEC can lead that culture in the field, which is like, what kind of dashboard could the field be looking at over time and see their reporting kind of come to feed into collective action and leadership. But just big picture, I just want to step back and say this is remarkable. And thank you for persisting and for taking the time and the energy to move to data during what was already a crisis and a lot of work. But I think there was no better way out than to get information and to keep getting information, to make better decisions, to serve the field better in the end and serve families and children.
And thank you for that. And I just need to give just a huge shout out to Jocelyn and the teams been working on this, because not only is it so important for us to have data, but things like the enrollment data, Jocelyn was pulling together different surveys at different time to try to capture those trends, to start, as you said, to start to think about what kind of metrics and dashboards should be tracking over time, so that the field understands what we're paying attention to collectively, and collectively using that to drive decision making. And so I know the teams overall at EEC, as we built the leadership team and really built the approach, have been digging into data. But what you see here is no small feat of what Jocelyn pulled together across multiple data sources. And so just huge shout out for that, being able to be such a driver of this conversation.
Yeah, I just want to add thank you to Third Sector for their work in analyzing some of this as well, and the team at EEC too.
Right.
So I just want to reflect on that, but want to highlight a couple of things as we go into the next steps here, and then can answer questions and talk through the next steps. Obviously, what you see in front of you is showing promising impact of the C3 grants, that we are seemingly stabilizing, that people are investing in the kind of expenses that we know will impact families, that will impact sustain workforce, and you know, as say, the workforce is the quality in early childhood education in many cases. So, and for the most part, so really understanding that we are sustaining not only the physical infrastructure, but really the human infrastructure that we need here. And I think as we look at the enrollment trends and the questions around how we are seeing people adjust their programming, expand classrooms, FCC's expanding hours, of trying to pair up what we're seeing and what people are investing in with some metrics on how that is influencing families' options, choices, and accessibility and affordability as we look forward. So as we have used this data and a fair amount of engagement with the field, we have started to design the next 6 months of the grant that we talked about at the last meeting. I will quickly highlight the components there in our next steps, and then can open it up for conversations across both the data we saw in the survey and also the ways we're using that data cohesively. So as we mentioned, we will be extending the grant for 6 months. The way that the grant works, just so everyone knows right now, is people apply, and then on a monthly basis, because there's real-time data that feeds their grant amount, they recertify that application and make any changes that might drive the grant calculations. And so starting in January, or continuing in January, programs will just be able to start recertifying for January the same way that they have been. There are a couple of things, as you all know, we mentioned this last time, I'll just reiterate. The eligible applicants at this point have been programs that were operating at the time of the ARPA bill signed. As we have opened up beyond the ARPA funding that EEC received, we've been able to open up to more programs. And so with this, we will also allow programs that were licensed or approved by EEC after March 11th to also be eligible for this funding as well. They do still have to meet the eligibility criteria of being open and operating for children, and not in a closed status, but that will open that up. We also right now programs self-report the number of educators, so the data that Jocelyn was looking at is also about that self-reported number. When we move to the registry, we'll be able to use the real-time educator information to track things like turnover rates and growth in educators, which we hope, again, take a significant burden off of programs of being able to pull that right out of their program lead roster, as opposed to having to submit that separately on a monthly basis. We've been, on a side note, we've been piloting with programs and user testing with programs, the registry, and many have said, this will make it so much easier for me to manage my program roster. So I think there's very promising success as we pull that out. So that's just the structure of maintaining the grants. We also have talked about doing this bonus, and we've been out talking with programs a lot about how we could capture the variety of investments that programs have already made in their workforce or intend to make in their workforce. And as we had conversations both across secretariats with our own work and understanding that increasing compensation for the workforce, as Sheila brought up before, is a strategy that people are using to be able to retain and recruit workforce. We wanted to give flexibility, not just in what strategy, not just in how they invested this, but also in coming up with local strategies to either increase salaries, bonus, sign-on bonuses, if that is what is working, and also benefits and thinking about professionalizing the field in ways that are locally meaningful. So we're hearing a lot of programs say the thing that sets myself as an employer apart from an Amazon, for example, or another employer that I'm competing with, is the fact that I offer childcare. So could I use these funds to provide that benefit to employees? So trying to really think creatively about how we offer as much flexibility on recruitment and retention strategies while still providing an incentive for programs to use this money for that account. So we've looked at trying to increase the bonus of $15 a slot. So right now, you'll remember it's $83 a slot as our baseline. Then it goes through the educator and the equity adjustment. We'd be looking to provide a $15 a slot bonus for programs that were able to retain or recruit workforce that have invested in benefits that are that work towards professionalizing the field, as many of the conversations here have revolved around, and particularly for FCCs on the kind of enhanced services that are really able to meet families' needs. So as Jocelyn pointed out, for FCCs, it's a little bit different to measure a salary if you are an independent proprietor, sole proprietor of your business. That's a slightly different metric. But if you are doing things that are costing you more hours, then that also has that impact of extending your hours into the evening, or provide, again, having an assistant or serving infant toddler, which limit your capacity. Those kind of things would we'd be looking to try to continue to incentivize in our bonus. So we, from conversations with the field, this is the structure that we think will meet the best, both meet the field where they are at in the investments and able to make, but also really incentivize the kind of strategies we know we need to be able to get families back into the workforce and meeting all of those complicated changes that they are experiencing, that we know our workforce shortages in childcare are really limiting limiting access to care that way. We will be going, as we have defined these metrics and start to look at appropriate thresholds, et cetera. We will be working with the field over the next 6 weeks to vet these the same way as we did with the formula early on, and making sure that we spend time getting feedback. We've done some small focus groups, some small questions just to make sure we're on the right track, and we'll be opening that up to a much bigger set of feedback over the next month so that we can make sure that we are launching something that takes into account the nuances of people's real staffing structures, and also the systems that we have in place to capture data, because obviously we want to hold it to something that we can do with fidelity and not just a self-report metric that we aren't able to make sure we're investing in equitably. So that is our plan of how we are using this data, how we saw the nuances and the variety of the ways people are spending it, and the way that we have pivoted for using our bonus just for endorsing or incentivizing a single strategy of workforce development, to really understanding a metric that can help us reflect the variety of strategies that programs might be using to be able to get to the final outcome, which is sustaining, expanding, professionalizing, and using our workforce, deploying our workforce to meet the needs of families that are changing. So with that, I think I will open it up and see if there are any more questions or concerns or thoughts as we progress.
Anything from folks? Jocelyn, thanks again for the presentation and all that is behind it, for sure. Thank you. Well done. Really well done. Okay, should we, Commissioner, you have you want to do the EEOST as part of this item, and then why don't we take a short break?
Sounds great.
Okay.
So obviously sending these operational grants in the field is great to sustain it. As you know, and as we have been voting on, we are continuing to invest our early education and out of school time capital grants into smaller facilities grants that will help people be able to make these kind of investments they need in their facilities, as opposed to the traditional large facility building grants that we have, given the fact that we know that people are pivoting and really trying to accommodate their business model. So what you have here are the regulations that just mirror the regulations you previously voted on for public comment. We did not receive any public comment on these, and so just affirming the regulations to move forward. So I think so I'm going to hand it back to you, Joseph, for the vote.
Okay, great. So with that in mind, I will make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care, in accordance with General Law, Chapter 15D, Section 3F, having solicited public comment as required by General Law, Chapter 30A, and having received none, hereby approves 606 CMR 15, the proposed amended regulations governing the early education and out of care school time capital fund program, and that the board also authorizes the Commissioner of Early Education and Care to file the proposed amended regulations with the Secretary of the Commonwealth for publication in the Massachusetts Register as 606 CMR 15 in accordance with General Law, Chapter 30A. May I please have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm just going to go off my screen. Maura Siegel.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Yes.
David Cruz.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald,
Yes.
Joni Block,
Yes.
Jamela Lee,
Yes.
Paul Belcedo.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Motion passed. Thank you, Commissioner. Why don't we take a 10-minute break and we will reconvene at 2:55. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, we're going to continue through this December meeting of the Board of Early Education and Care in Massachusetts. I'm going to turn it back to the commissioner on this item of parent fees. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So I wanted, as you all have known and been engaged with us on the development of a new parent fee chart for our subsidies. And I know there are some new board members or others who may not know the total impact of this. So I'd like to just take a second and contextualize what you have on the slides between slide 24 and 26. Both on what is the structure of our parent fees, a quick note on what we did to create this parent fee chart for those of you new to the board specifically, as well as where this fits into some of our subsidy revisions overall that we are engaging in. And so the structure of our subsidies, just to understand exactly what the parent fee is for those of you, I know I had a couple of board members call and say, like, what are we doing here? So just to give a little bit of context, the federal government that funds the majority of our EEC subsidies that support parent tuition for low-income working families, they require a parent copay be part of the fee. So we have a fee that is set a rate that is set, and getting into some of the next section, they require that rate be, so the amount of a per child subsidy based on age and full-time or part-time be set to a market rate. So we do a market rate survey. We set our rate according to the percentile of the market rate. And then a parent is responsible for a portion of that subsidy as their copay required by federal government, by the federal regulations. So as I started in this role, we had some litigation that prompted a revision of our parent fee chart. It turns out as we dug into it, it hadn't been updated in a significant amount of time. And so we took this opportunity to really dig in to understand the structure of that co-payment schedule across our subsidy scale. Through many conversations and iterations and updates and work with Urban Institute, we came up with a parent fee chart that describes the copay on each subsidy based on family size and income level. And the innovative component that we have implemented here is that all income under the federal poverty level is held harmless from being applied to that copay. So for example, if you are, if your family size of 2 and you're making 99% of the federal poverty level and you get a raise and you go to 101%, you're only paying that copay amount on the 1% over the federal poverty level and not on all the income that you were not being charged before. I think when you think about the governor's focus on learn to earn and back to work, that making sure that as families are offered income raises and minimum wage raises, all of the income, the increases in salaries and compensation we hope our families get to benefit of for self-sustainability, that we don't want that to be eaten up or taken or to disincentivize that by having co-pays charged as they're starting to increase salary. And so this has been, I think, an incredibly, knowing that when we developed this, we were the only state in the country looking at that kind of modification to our co-payments was an incredible feat to the team that here really dug into that and started to think through how we could be more parent friendly in this structure and take advantage of this moment, not just to update our chart, but actually think critically about what we could do to move the system forward for families. So you all voted on that chart and the implementation of that chart, but because of the implementation timeline and COVID, we have been supporting the parent fees for our subsidized population since March of 2020. We have recognize that this parent fee chart implementation is the first step of adjustments to our subsidy regulations and our subsidy structures overall. So we're very thoughtful about the ways that we've implemented this. What you have in front of you today is our plan on not only what the key changes are to the parent copay structure, and reminder of the benefit that this will be for parents, but also our plan to roll this out. This plan that you have on page 26 indicates the training schedule and the support schedule that our subsidy administrators, and I'll explain their role in a second, will have over the next few weeks, and parents getting letters about their new payment schedule through the first weeks of January, and be asked to start collecting the parent portion of fees starting February 1st. That means that starting February 1st for children enrolled in February 1st, EEC will no longer cover that percentage of the parents' the copay, and will be asking programs to collect that from parents themselves again. So knowing, for those of you that are intimately familiar with our child care financial assistance database, you know that there's many nuances to technology when you're trying to do enrollment and billing modules. And so all of the technology updates have been made, but one of the things that this system relies on is the subsidy administrators, which is a designated role at each one of our either providers or our child care resource and referral agencies that manage our subsidies, have to go in, print out the letters for families and send them to the family to make sure that they do have all of the information they need to start paying again, and help them support them through all the questions. So knowing that, we will spend the next few weeks really making sure with webinars and office hours and policy guides and updates that all of our subsidy administrators have the instructions and the tools that they need to start that work. We notified our providers that payments will be expected to be collected from parents again starting February 1st. We'll be sending general notification to parents next week, and letting them know that they'll get a letter in the first weeks of January. And so that will be our timeline and rollout. Again, training schedule, we have just the weeks and here that they'll start, but it will start next week. We'll have the dates listed on our website this afternoon, and people will be able to log on and get the dates. And those are really targeted, just to make sure everyone knows, those aren't general webinars. These are really targeted to those subsidy administrators that have the bulk of the work to do. So the general information will go out in our email, and we'll make sure everyone who might be working with parents in different ways, for example, I know Nikki's organization supports a lot of parents in getting to subsidies. So making sure everyone has the information that they need, and encourage anyone who feels that they have gaps or need additional information to reach out to us, and we can make sure parents have what they need as they go back to starting to support fees. So a little bit of update there on our implementation, and really wanting to make sure that you all knew that this not only was going into effect and part of our rollout of the vote that the board has taken on implementing this fee, but also understanding that this is just highlighting again that this is the first step for us of also revising our subsidy regulations that were part of the strategic action plan and part of our ongoing conversations with stakeholders, as well as identifying where investments and streamlining eligibility and enrollment processes might be had over the next years as we look at our contracts and grants and other areas that support subsidized families. Knowing that many of you know our contracts are extremely outdated, so having to address the fact that moving, and you'll see this in some of the data we'll talk about in the caseload, that we don't have the flexibility to move slots to new locations, for example, which is going to be critical, as you all know, as we've discussed, as parents' worlds are changing around them. So that's our next steps after the parent fee, but very essential to make sure the parent fees were in place before we started to make additional modifications to our subsidy system. I'll make one more note and happy to answer questions, which is the subsidy policies that we've had in place through COVID, aside from waiving, the payment of parent fees on behalf of parents, will continue to be in place through December, and where we look in the new year to make any of those adjustments after the parent fees have been successfully implemented.
Great.
Joni.
Sheila, Nikki, Joni. Go ahead, Sheila. You're muted. Sheila, you're muted right now. Sheila, you're muted.
Let's take care of that. Thank you. I'm wondering if you can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Good. Have you heard that or got any indication that families might object to paying parent fees every time their classroom has to close for some sort of, COVID quarantine? Has that been an issue for anybody?
For the emergency closures?
Yeah.
So that's the policy that has been in place for long standing prior to this. And what we are offering programs, particularly with operational grants going out, is they will be adjusting our policy language to ensure that they can adjust parent fees or not collect parent fees. But our system, unfortunately, because we don't track the emergency closures, we wouldn't be able to pay on behalf of parents during those days because our system doesn't track those in the same way. But we are providing flexibility for programs to be able to work with parents and not requiring them, if there is a case where they are able to have to collect fees from parents during that time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Nikki, and then Joni.
Thanks. And I just wanted to reiterate what I've said before, which is that I'm very excited about the new fee structure. I think it's a big improvement. It is unfortunate that it is going to be going into place after parents have had to not pay for so long. I think it won't feel like a good thing to them. It'll feel like a bad thing because it'll go from having to not pay to having to pay something, which is really unfortunate that it will end up feeling that way instead of feeling like a big reduction, which it will be for most of them. Yeah. I was just wondering if there has been a plan that's been discussed for parents that are struggling to pay the new fees, just because, again, it is going from not having to pay at all to having to pay something. And what kind of guidance the providers have been given around navigating that with families. Because I can imagine that, we've been struggling with enrollments anyway. And once this goes into place, we're likely to see, somewhat of a drop off in enrollments, I would guess.
Yes. So there's two things that we've done on that. First of all, our provisional authorizations, which still cover job search and are expanding to maternity, paternity leave, will have zero. We have to make some minor policy modifications, but essentially parents will still not be required to contribute to their subsidy in those cases. And we still do have the extended provisional authorization. So we hope that many families who are struggling will be captured in that component. We have provided more in our policy guide that's going out, more reiterated the flexibility that we've given to programs to try to work with families. Not be punitive if families get behind, and those kind of strategies. Unfortunately, because it is a federal requirement that there is no way that we can say they don't have to pay fees, and except for certain categories like provisional authorizations for families. So we're trying to work with our providers to understand where and how they can be flexible, and as families are working through the recovery themselves. And I appreciate the fact that even though this is a beneficial for families, and it is coming at a time where it's a little bit complicated in rollout. And I do think that, we are working on the letters that families receive to highlight that this is a reduction in their fees, although, that it will go back to being expected of their contribution. And I think this is another question, long-term, Nikki, you said the long-term of trying to think of additional strategies we can use to help parent fees. We don't have the systems in place to be able to sort of support it whole cloth. So working with programs right now, but I think as we revise our subsidy structure, and no ideas that have come from a variety of different ways are other ways that we might be able to provide emergency funding for programs who need support helping families cover fees. And we are looking into that as part of our overall subsidy revisions. And if there are opportunities to build more of those systems in place as we make more of the system improvements overall in the coming year.
That's great. Thanks, Sam. I just am very conscious of the ways that, families make budgets. And then, if you get used to budgeting a certain thing and then there's a big change, it's going to be tough for some families.
Yep, absolutely. And unfortunately, we don't have all of the perfect emergency systems in place right now, but trying to give programs flexibility while we build them over the next year.
Yeah. Joni.
Well, thanks. A lot of my questions were just addressed between Sheila, Nikki, and Sam, so thank you. I can appreciate, even though I have a tiny bit of, only a tiny bit of experience in the depth of complications in sending out these communications, and most importantly, making sure they're received. Whether they're addressed is another question, but making sure they're received. And I wonder, with your emergencies and with the ways of dealing with some of this, is there a way we can keep track of, or general buckets of these unintended consequences of, a family is transient and moves from place to place, and so they don't receive the letter. And we know that happens, and the R&Rs and case managers are right on top of it. But we don't want these kids to lose their placement. Mm-hmm. And how are we going to keep track of it, deal with it?
Yep.
We also don't know what we don't know will come up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. We are in regular conversations with our subsidy administrators and hope by the office hours that we hold throughout January, we'll capture some of those and be able to address real time some of the complications. In terms of the addresses and connecting, we do ask our subsidy administrators to make sure that they do connect with each family, and we can try to track. I'm trying to think of ways we could track how many are successful in being able to do that, or without creating an additional burden on them as well, knowing how much work this is. But I think that, the subsidy particularly for our contracted providers, where the subsidy administrator actually sits at the site that the family is attending, they should have a fairly robust way to make sure that they are actually connecting with families and are aware of this. The CCR&R question, they're a little bit more distant from the day-to-day with the family. And so that I think we do anticipate that there will be more challenges with income eligible families who are going through the CCR&Rs just for all of the reasons you say, and are working really hard with the CCR&Rs to make sure that that we are sending letters where they have the capacity to be prepared for that kind of follow-up. And I think it's hopefully the office hours will help us collect those really nuanced issues that come up and either triage or plan the systems going forward.
Thanks. I recognize the challenges, and thank you all in advance.
Yeah, well, thank you to the subsidy administrators who are going to be doing the bulk of the work and of course the team who reconfigured everything, wrote the policy guide here, but then, that it does go out with our subsidies, does go out to, 550 or so individuals who then are in charge of, actually connecting with the families directly. And so very, very thankful for their diligent work to do so.
And I appreciate the fact that you will send the communications out in multiple ways. Let me just say that the CFCEs are just one other vehicle.
Absolutely.
And information to families too.
Yeah, and Joni, as you know, I think we have been very intentional as much as possible of trying to include at least a bullet point on what we're doing across all of our stakeholders so that people, can support families, even if you don't know everything. If a family asks, you at least recognize that it's I often find that families may ask a question like, hey, I heard this one thing, and because I can kind of connect it to this other thing, I now know how to navigate, because they experience it from their perspective and not necessarily from EEC's perspective. Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Excellent. So there's no vote or anything needed on this one. Just wanted to make sure we were getting in front with the robust rollout plan, and obviously any other questions or thoughts and contributions, we'd be very happy to take. And expect to see an email from us in the next couple of days with a lot more detailed information that some of you may be interested in, and very happy to dig in as you see those and answer any additional questions.
Great, and we'll just stay tuned on adjustments or things that come up in the new year as the rollout progresses, for sure. So thank you for considering the complexities, and especially for the multi-pronged communication strategy.
Excellent.
Let's turn now to the budget.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight here. And I think, Charles, so as you said, we look to the new year and thinking about our subsidy system. It's traditionally represented such a 85% of our budget. And so the revisions there and taking this feedback are certainly part of where we're looking at FY22 of making sure that we're making strategic investments that also start setting us up for those learnings of what should and how can we adapt our subsidy system overall to make sure we're maximizing our funding and to make sure that we are maximizing access and supports for programs and providing that access to families. So the first thing that I the first thing that we will do today is to vote on the subsidy increase. And so just to give you a little context, and then I'll hand it over for the vote. The last few years, the legislature and the administration have written into the budget a subsidy rate reserve. So as you can imagine, when we take our children and we give additional funding for each child, that has a cost implication on our caseload accounts. And so this set aside money, it is designated to increase the percentage rate that as compared to the market rate that we give for our subsidies. What we have done in this case what we do in this case is be able to maximize the percentage increase that we can give with the $20 million and make sure that we are also, as like last year, paying attention to some of the nuances in our system of ways that we need to address some of the rates. So last year, for example, we increased transportation rates significantly given some of the challenges we were seeing in transportation. So this year, that rate reserve covers our administrative rates and our rates for our group and school age programs. And then we match that to our family childcare rate increase, as you know, is under a collective bargaining agreement with SEIU. So when we looked at the rates this year, one of the things I want to highlight is that we did opt to increase the administrative add-on rate for $2 specifically. And one of the things that add-on support goes to cover is some of those comprehensive services that our most vulnerable children really need in order to be successful in an early education and care program. And so given the huge challenges that we know we are seeing as children return to care or are recovering from a couple years of pretty dramatic experiences, we wanted to make sure that we were reflecting that in this rate increase to be able to ensure people have the an adequate increase to that add-on rate that would be dedicated to those comprehensive services. So with that, we were able to provide a 4% across the board increase for all of our subsidy rates, plus a $2 a day increase to our administrative add-on rate that will be implemented retroactive to July 1st and go out in our January contracts and payments is the hope. So that is what we are voting on today. Happy to answer any questions, but wanted to provide the baseline.
Just one quick question. Is that's annualized, Commissioner?
Yes, that is annualized. So
Bravo, bravo.
Yes. Yep. So that will be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Joni.
Can you just give an example of what some of the administrative add-on might cover? I mean, I'm imagining, but I'm just curious.
Mental health services is certainly a big one that it goes towards. Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I realized I didn't say that. And that is one of the driving reasons to be able to support this. It often goes to mental health, but also social services in general, that you can think of the suite of things that are matched to the family.
Is there a way we can kind of track how those dollars? One more thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, the way that the subsidy payments work, they go retroactively to support enrolled children. And so there isn't a way to track. This is one of the things we've had as we pivot to the operational grant. There isn't a way to track their spending on this. But I think this is where we're trying to get a little bit more feedback on operational budgets and work with some economists to understand how that is going. But this is one of the challenges I know previously we've asked attestations for programs to say what they're spending it on, but there's no possible way for us to get a reporting, unfortunately, of it.
Well, thank you. And I understand. I'm glad that there are going to be funds available for those types of services.
Yeah, and we are definitely hoping, I think, with some of our mental health consultation, which we'll talk about in a second of where we're working on some of that, that we can look at the impact of services through a couple other lenses too, that will help us get a glimpse into what this is doing.
Great. With that, I'm going to make the motion that the Board of Early Education and Care hereby approves the department's recommended 4% across the board rate increase to all center-based rates and the FCC system administration rate, and the recommended $2 increase to the daily add-on rate, bringing the rate from $20 to $22. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
Thank you, Nikki. Joni Block.
Yes.
Sheila Balboni.
Yes.
Carolyn Kane.
Yes.
Nikki Ruiz.
Yes.
Secretary Pizer.
Yes.
Paul Belcito.
Yes.
Allison Schoenwald.
Yes.
Jamela Lee.
Yes.
Maura Siegel.
Yes.
Motion passed. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. And I'll turn it back to you. Talk about the caseload and the non-caseload sort of picture.
Yep. Excellent. So there are two things as we reach this midway point of FY22 that we wanted to update on. One, you have an outline of the budget increases that EEC was awarded in FY22 to specific line items and how we'll be allocating those. So I'll talk through that. But one of the things I wanted to highlight as we look at that is some of the caseload numbers that are in the appendix, that for all of you to contextualize this funding. So obviously that as I mentioned, caseload has traditionally been the bulk of our expenditures at EEC. And one of the things that we experienced over the last year, since March of 2020, which led us to support operational grants and thinking about different strategies, was the difficulty that we had keeping families enrolled during COVID. And one of the federal government requirements for our federal subsidies is you can only pay for enrolled or attending children. So you can't pay for children who aren't actively enrolled or attending childcare. We have made the pivot to create unlimited absences so that if a family can't attend regularly but still needs to be in that slot, that we are able to make some modifications of there. We have done things, as you know, over the last couple of years that have really tried to, throughout COVID, have tried to provide as much flexibility as we could with our subsidies. We have opened up the flex pool, which is the cap that programs experience on contracted slots. So knowing that our contracts were not always in the right places, we wanted to give people the ability to over enroll in their contracts. So we've done some of that. We've extended the job search period so that families are able to get into care while they're getting back to work, which we knew was often a barrier for families of coordinating the start of care and the start of work. We really have kept in as many flexible policies as we could. But if you notice in the caseload numbers, we are still seeing drops in subsidized enrollment this year. And so I say that in that obviously we continue to explore our policy options and our work across secretariats to see how could we partner and support enrollment in our subsidies better actively, particularly with the numbers as we've looked at them in the last week, reached out to providers who are actually enrolling subsidized children and understand why and how families are exiting care and not enrolling. But ultimately, this has led to, as we look at the you can see in two things. One, in just our caseload numbers, but also in our contracted numbers. You can see in let's get through the page number, page 36, on page 37, where our contracted providers, which look and see, we still are at about an 80% enrollment in our contracted slots. That those are individual agencies who contract for specific populations to serve, as opposed to those families that go through a child care resource and referral agency to get to a subsidy. So despite all these efforts, we know that we have to think about other strategies to support families and our providers in order to really adequately do our public service role of trying to support this really fragile sector during this moment in time. And I point that out that obviously we're still actively working on that, but as we talk about the budget investments we're making on slides 29 and 30, that is intentionally trying to think about supplementing the complications we're having and trying to use our traditional system of dispersing dollars through subsidies, given that we don't control parents' choice to enroll. We can incentivize, we can support our programs, but ultimately it becomes the family's decision to enroll in the subsidy. So a couple of things as we pivot to slide 29 and 30 around where we have seen increases and what we are opting to do on that. So obviously we just talked about the rate reserve and made that increase. And so that is self-explanatory, I hope. The second component is our parent fees that you see there. So the legislature did allocate almost $9 million to help support the parent fee cost, so that when we picked up the cost, so that on behalf of the parent, but that cost was significantly more than what the legislature provided. And so just wanted to highlight there that contributed to it, but that still is a cost that we were putting out as a way to be able to support parents despite the fact that the enrollment was low, and to incentivize them to come into our subsidies. The Next component is the operational reserve. And so for those subsidized providers, the language around this was pretty restrictive as to the ways we could put it out to our field, and did require us to put out a per child amount that was equivalent across all children and slots. And so given that, we did choose an enrollment date as late as we possibly could and still get the money out, knowing that enrollment was still fluctuating. And so used September 30th, took a snapshot of enrollment, took the $60 million that was dedicated to this purpose, and ended up with just over $1,300 per slot that was allocated to each provider with an enrolled subsidized child. And so given that, that money will go out to providers in January as a one-time grant. And particularly as we're seeing lower enrollment, hope that that helps sustain our providers through the winter specifically. The rest of the funds, the operational reserve, where you see at the bottom of page 29, was money that was underspent from our subsidy account last year because of under enrollment. And so being able to, that's transferred into a reserve that allowed us to push that out into the field and things other than the subsidy. So I mentioned the 60 million of that it goes out to the provider, the per slot grant to providers. And then the rest of it is dedicated mostly to PPE, which we have been providing to providers throughout the pandemic and will do so through April. That provides most of that funding, and as well as some work that we are investing in terms of workforce. So some of the professional pathways and some of the other components that we have enhanced our workforce work and registry help desk, things like that are coming out of that as well. We do anticipate needing, we're estimating now the PPE through April, and do anticipate potentially having to allocate across the 33 and 8 million a little bit more to the 33 million, which is why we haven't fully allocated the 8 million workforce, because we believe that PPE, particularly as we look at the health and safety landscape, is an important investment for us right now, as we look at some of the other components of what we're doing. So turning on to the next page and highlighting some of those investments, the CRSA dollars, was the 131 million of federal dollars that was allocated to childcare, and that is going to continue the operational grants. And sorry, we use the old language of stabilization grants in this, but it's the as we pivot to operational sustainability, that they will this will be the dollars used to support that in an ongoing way. Again, I think it's important, the flexibility that was written in there allows us to get money through our operational grants, which is independent of enrollment, and particularly right now, very important for us to be able to do that. The rest, I think we'll talk through. These are specific initiatives or line items that support specific components of our system that we wanted to talk about, our priorities for what could be one-time funding for some of those, and make sure that we are, again, aligning with overall system priorities despite the existence of, or the uncertainty of the ongoing nature of some of this funding. And so with the access management line, this is the line that supports our childcare resource and referral energy and efforts, as well as Mass 211, and supports getting parents to the programs that they need. We're in the process of talking to the childcare resource and referral agencies right now around what kinds of one-time expenses might be most appropriate in this year. But one of the things we're really looking for as you look at our caseload accounts, as you look at our provisional authorizations and looking at job search needs, is where we might be able to invest in work with the CCR&Rs that would help access help parents access employment and get to employment and be able to get back into the workforce, and really thinking about, given the moment in time we are in, what kinds of strategies would be most appropriate to meet that need of families, and partner with the Mass Hire Boards and the other networks that job seekers might be looking at to help connect their parents to those resources. And many of our CCR&Rs actually do house some employment services in their organization. So really hoping that these one-time funds could help enhance or bridge some of the connections they may already have some foundation for going forward.
I think over the years, we really need to recognize how flexible, or how they help us with our flexibility and being nimble. They jump into the fray when we call upon them. And I really appreciate that over the years. Seen lots of examples of it.
Absolutely. And they're a critical resource for our families specifically, and trying to understand what our families need right now that we could help,
Exactly.
help invest in. The next is the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership, and that had a $5 million increase year over year. We had money, the sustaining the grants that exist, and then really trying to understand, as we learn from the last couple years, where investments at the community level would help. And so again, huge shout out to the teams that worked on this at EEC, because this has been a lot of really good listening and weaving together the components that we've seen, but from our summer step up program, and from the ways communities have come together this school year to think about preschool expansion across different elements of the mixed delivery system, have really understood that communities could use some support around both planning for that, but also we have some of our communities that maybe jumped into implementation and need to think about planning and implementing simultaneously, given the urgency of 2021. And so as we've endured that, we've structured these grants as a way that both could support continued implementation for programs that started, or for communities that started expansion and now need to think about, who and how do we make sure that that expansion is fully maximized, and supports childcare in a robust way, and not just school districts, but also bring more districts that, in particular, districts that are thinking about investing ESRA funds or other local resources into preschool expansion, to help them think through that intentionally, given our lessons learned from CPPI and Summer Step Up of the ways that, and preschool expansion grant, of ways that really help honor the unique nature of the business model with childcare and still provide that. For example, many programs are doing a per child amount, many school districts do a per child amount for funding for universal preschool, which becomes really complicated if they're doing it based on enrollment. And we know our providers need multiple funding streams in order to support a single child many times. And so what eligibility do you use, and how can you negotiate that? So we have been, I think, the team and in really meaningful ways on the ground, really thinking about this and working on this planning and implementation strategies through this new funding, and very excited about not only what that will show for our communities, but also the national lessons as people talk about universal preschool at the federal level, that we're actually able to push up and understand how you really do this in a mixed delivery system in a way that doesn't run into some of the unintended consequences that large cities have run into as they've expanded preschool and seen a real impact on things like infant toddler services. So really being thoughtful around that. And many lessons learned we're excited to share as federal conversations continue as well. And then the CFCE and Parent Child Plus, there was a small increase to the parent-child plus element of the of that money. And so what has happened is traditionally we have the coordinated family and community engagement grantees, and we have provided money for them to implement a parent-child plus home visiting model. There was an increase to that money this year, so we took programs that had waiting lists of children and were able to implement quickly and tried to expand as quickly as we could. However, we also, one other dynamic there, we also knew that while we were trying to serve families, that workforce was going to be a huge issue of actually addressing the needs of those families. So the other question we asked is, who has workforce ready to train and enhance and expand? So a part-time employee that could go full-time, workforce that maybe was someone looking to step into a home visitor role, to make sure that we were deploying these in a way that could impact families as quickly as possible with as little barriers as possible. Same thing as we look at the mental health grantees, we've been doing the same thing. We also, I have to say, the mental health consultation is an incredible asset for Massachusetts, but we also see that there are a lot more mental health needs that they are able to address, particularly right now in our programs. And so we certainly look to see where we could expand services, but this will be an ongoing place for us in conversations with our mental health consultation grantees to understand what other gaps we're seeing and how we can fill some of those in as we look forward through this year and the next. Many times I think the critical one we've talked about is that they're not able to meet as quickly is those urgent crisis level needs of, I have a child in my program who is dysregulating and need to address the urgent crisis, and is not so much a consultation as an intervention, and really needing to think about how we build some of that out with them and where we fill in some gaps that they can't provide. Finally, I wanted to address the one that is not in this budget, but that is outstanding from the FY21 budget for us, which is the public-private trust. Let me say this also in the CFCE and mental health really quickly before I talk about the public-private trust. We will be able to do this through contract expansions and enhancements. So what we are able to do, I've been working with the comptroller's office, is extend the contracts a year to be able to make sure that we aren't causing chaos in the system of these desperately needed programs in the meantime. And so really making sure that we are, for those programs, building as much stability while we deploy one-year funding in them as well. So the public-private trust, back to that one, was a $500,000 trust that was dedicated by the legislature prior to any of the federal funding coming through. So, you know, to be just quite candid, when we first saw $500,000, it felt like a lot to get out the door, and then $300 million came, and that kind of pivoted us to focus over there. And so based on the last few conversations, the last board meetings, and understanding where and how we are building out our workforce structure, we have been suggested working with the board on trying to identify some priorities for competency-based trainings and workforce strategies based on the last board meeting we had, and really culling through some of the or leveraging some of the excitement that we had from board members in really engaging and thinking about the application of competency-based strategies to this field, and also supporting EEC and really defining something very new that is not universally understood the same way, and helping us create a definition that really reflects the nuances of competency-based training, but the application to this real specific sector. So we'll be looking at that over the next few weeks and hope that in early 2022, we could launch a more formal structure that would help us deploy those dollars in the most thoughtful way that would also inform our ongoing professional development and credentialing system in real time as we build it. And so I highlight that. I know that that is seemingly a laundry list of expenditures, but also really wanted people to see that there were increases and meaningful investments in our work besides the operational grants and subsidies over this year, and ways that we are thoughtfully trying to put those out in the field and work with the field to make sure that we are having the most impact as possible and as responsive as possible. We know the need out there across, every sector is far surpasses the resources that anyone has in any department. And so really thinking strategically about priorities is really what is driving our work here, and wanted to show how those are being reflected in our allocations. And with that, I think I'm happy to answer any questions, or I didn't go in deep detail of the appendix of the caseload numbers, just highlighted some of the notable components, but happy to answer any questions there too.
Questions or comments for the commissioner? I mean, big picture. Certainly, the time is now for many. We're stretched and it's a tough time on all fronts. So I appreciate obviously just how you're trying to balance what would be many competing priorities, but not everything can be a priority when it comes to budgeting. So let me just say that publicly. Trying to do a lot with a little often, especially in this work, and especially as we start to think about issues like mental health. I was looking at some data the other day that are truly staggering. I could probably turn it to Allison Schoenwald, who would confirm, but we were in a crisis pre-pandemic, and honestly, the data are just stunning right now, and really dramatic in terms of what they mean for what we really need to do as a country, birth to adolescence. So any questions, comments?
I guess.
Joni, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just raised my hand. I'm trying to formulate a question. This was just a lot of information. And just moving forward, I'm wondering if and how some of these initiatives can be, can and or should be intertwined, so that we're meeting the needs of what you have talked about in terms of building community capacity, in increasing quality, in increasing the options for families. Excuse me. Sorry, and I'm thinking about particularly the CPPI grants, the CFCE grants, and how you envision they might look well down the road.
Yes, I think there's two components to that answer, and we'll start this. And one of the reasons I laid this out this way this time was to also be able to connect as we are ongoing, where we hope some of the impacts are in a dashboard. We are continue to work on the data that we should be tracking quarterly, annually. And I think, Jane, one of the questions that you asked is like, that's a way that we, I think, intend to tie a lot of this together, is if we are deploying it strategically, we should not see the impact just in a single grant, but in the metrics that we're tracking overall. So those are some of, unfortunately, I've given up the plane analogy, but like that we're like playing in the fort while we're building it. And so we're trying to figure all of this out while we're also building the dashboard. And I think that's just the reality of the recovery mode we're in right now. But that said, I think that there are, with some of the specific, like when you point out CPPI, for the team and for EEC, and I'm not sure it's always comes across as cleanly in the board meetings, it is a progression of a community level investment. We did preschool expansion. That pivoted to CPPI before I got here, but we were tracking and doing deep analysis of the CPPI. That led into lessons that had some summer step up components to understand how it could invest, and then moved into this expansion of CPPI. And I think what the team here has done amazing job of starting to build the inroads for is weaving that kind of initiative in the interreliance of our services on each other to build more systems to do that. It's not perfect, it's coming together, but I think as we expand, we're really intentional of like, okay, can we go to CPPI communities to test something? Is that appropriate? Or, you know, how do we make sure that our programs know that these resources are available so that we can start to track progress for the and see the impact overall.
Great. Allison.
I just wasn't sure if you wanted me to comment. I mean, of course, I agree that, you know, the long-term impact of COVID is clearly going to be the social emotional impact of young children. It's not the loss of actual learning. The learning loss is going to be caught up. But I can't tell you, I mean, even today, you know, why are these kids at 4 coming in and they're so incredibly impaired and nobody knows because they've been home for 2 years. And this happens, you know, every day. So it's really great to see that in all the national conversation, the importance of childcare is coming up, but the nitty gritty is clearly the social emotional well-being. That's just going to have clearly, you know, is going to change the field, and what it's going to look like in 10 and 20 years is going to look different because of this.
Yeah. And it's interesting because pre-pandemic, it was about sort of trauma-informed practice, right? Little did we know, like applying a universal lens and set of practices to what was increasing experiences of trauma, stress, and adversity. Little did we know there was a pandemic coming that would just had a call the other day from someone overseeing middle schools where the behavior is feeling unprecedented to them and sort of reaching out, looking for support. I mean, to your point, you can't disentangle the learning and the social emotional, and you can't get to the learning, right? We know that. We know that.
And I will just add to that, because I think this is a running theme across everything, is trying to, you know, we've been trying to invest in too, is that in order to best address that issue, it's about the humans on the ground, right? It's about the workforce. It's about their ability to be responsive, their ability to put aside their own trauma, or, you know, handle their own trauma and be that support, that emotionally responsive caregiver. And that is takes a fair amount of investment in the people, both in resources they have, in recruitment and support for them. And I think one of the themes across everything we've been investing in is how do we prioritize investments in the people, despite one-time funding? How do we prioritize the investments in the people to try to address exactly, as you said, Allison, that to mitigate the long-term impact on children is going to take us investing in the adults who are there to care for them.
Yeah, and we're gonna, you know, we'll have more conversation, obviously, in the new calendar year and the balance of the fiscal year, kind of picking up full circle from our retreat to today's conversation about the business community and what that means for the childcare model. And, you know, I think we want to, as we talk about educators, I think we want to think about the structures and the processes, right? And so love to talk more with Jamila about some of the benefits work and the work, you know, thinking about conditions and compensation, small c, not just wages. And then there's the process side, which is you can have the structures in place and those types of conditions for working and not have worked enough on the skills and competencies, which is the process side of the work. So it all has to come together for sure, no question. Other thoughts, comments before we adjourn on this last item, budget? Well, let me reiterate the thanks to the commissioner, but especially to the team that's behind her doing lots of this work, and the partnership with third sector, which we saw in action today, and for being able to move what I see as sort of moving between the day-to-day work on the ground and the operations and the strategic work, and trying to really connect the two. And I appreciate how that continues to be a feature of these meetings, and the data more and more coming to the center of those conversations. So thank you all for a great meeting, and for the tremendous work of EEC and the team, and especially great thanks at the end of this calendar year to the educators and the caregivers and all of the families and their partnerships. to make a go of things for our youngest children in the Commonwealth. Want to wish everybody a safe and happy holiday season and look forward to seeing you all in the new year. Take care. Meeting
Thank you,
adjourned.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Meeting adjourned.